The bones of the dead lie heaped in piles, steaming blood is everywhere plastered, the earth is scorched dry, and no matter where you look, your heart aches, wrote the warlord Ma Zhongying in 1933. 2 years earlier, Ma had gone to war against the governor of the province of Xinjiang, whose misrule had provoked a rebellion in the oasis of Hami. Fanning the flames with shrill religious language, he exhorted Xinjiang's Kazakhs, Uyghurs, and ethnic Chinese Muslims to cease to be the slaves of the Khan. Wars, of course, never have a happy ending. The celestial garden of refuge has become nothing more than the home of tearful gods and wailing spirits, Ma concluded. Thank you for watching this week's episode of The Print Explorer. Earlier this month, China and India signed an agreement intended to end their 4-year military confrontation of the line of actual control. The story I'm going to tell you about today, about a decade of ill-fated rebellion in Xinjiang, is a small but important piece of the puzzle about how China and India ended up at war in the first place. Like all good stories, this one has a central character, the son of a humble peasant born in a wind-beaten Kazakh yurt in 1899 in the mountains of Altai, the most remote, God-forsaken region of China's most remote province, Xinjiang. Lavrenti Beria, Joseph Stalin's spy master, called this peasant son the Kazakh Robin Hood. Nationalist Chinese officials in Nanjing sometimes described him as an ally, but also called him incorrigible and unpredictable. Later, as they hunted him down, the Chinese communists decried him as a bandit, and Douglas McKiernan, who later became the very first CIA operative to be killed in covert service, viewed him as an asset who could play a critical role in World War III. This is the story of Osman Batur, great warrior, the honorific means. Others called him the son of Islam. Earlier this week, the Print's columnist and former Northern Army Commander General H.S. Panag wrote a fascinating article reminding us that the Indian Army first brushed up against the People's Liberation Army in 1951, when Kazakh Cossack cavalry of the National Revolutionary Army of Chiang Kai-shek, pursued by the PLA, sought asylum in India at Chushul. This is the very year China seized power in Tibet, and a couple of years before the PLA is known to have dispatched patrols into territory claimed by India. The question that Shekhar Gupta, the editor-in-chief of The Print, put to me was, who were these Kazakhs and what happened to them? And the answer to that question is the story of Usman. For those of you interested in researching further, by the way, you can find links to that article as well as to a fabulous paper by the American historian Justin Jacobs and a riveting book by Andrew Forbes, on which I've drawn extensively for this article. Lots of viewers have been asking me for links, and I'll try to make a practice of this in future episodes. To understand the story, you have to grasp that Central Asia looked very different in the 1920s to the way we understand it now. China had an amban or governor in Xinjiang as it did in Tibet. In India, we understand the world through the prism of our colonial subjugation by Great Britain, but it was not the only empire in this neighborhood. I'm not talking about the French or the Portuguese or other European powers either. The Russian Empire, later the Soviet Union, was steadily expanding its power in Central Asia. The Qing dynasty in China was pushing its borders forward too. We can debate if this was imperialism as we today understand it or not, but the bottom line was that peoples used to semi-independence or independence were being brought under the heel of large, powerful powers. Even though Chinese rulers had a long history of involvement with Xinjiang going back to the 5th century of the Common Era, and the Kumul-Turfan region was a vassal state of the Ming dynasty, it was only in the mid-18th century that the province came under the direct rule of the Beijing emperor. Kashgar, Xinjiang's most important city, was finally captured by the Qing in 1758. For the next several decades, Xinjiang was torn apart by rebellions, and Qing power waned and waxed. From the late 19th centuries, though, the structure of Chinese administration had embedded themselves throughout Xinjiang. But the story was very far from ending. In 1911, you see, the Qing dynasty was overthrown by Sun Yat-sen's Republican nationalists, an event which had dramatic consequences for Chinese power in Xinjiang. In December that year, uprisings broke out in Ili and Urumqi under the leadership of disaffected Han officers. The leaders of the Urumqi uprising were beheaded or tortured to death, and the rebellion was quickly crushed. However, the rebels succeeded in seizing power in some areas and setting up a rival administration under the leadership of Yang Chuan-hu. Xinjiang, though, was a barren demographic soil for the establishment of ethnic Han power. There are no reliable figures for the early part of the 20th century, but we know that in 1949, the largest group were the Uyghurs, numbering 2.94 million. The second largest national group were also Muslims, the Kazakh, numbering an estimated 319,000. The third were the Kyrgyz, numbering about 65,000. A further 200,000 inhabitants of the province were Han, Chinese settlers, soldiers and officials, while the remaining 75,000 to 100,000 people were made up of Mongols, Russians, Tungusic peoples, and a few Tibetans, Afghans, and even Hindu Banya moneylenders. Yang Sengxin, the king governor of Xinjiang, continued to rule after 1911 using a combination of craft and ruthlessness. The problems he faced, though, grew after the Soviet Revolution and the winds of change it brought to Central Asia. To many young Muslims in Xinjiang, the Soviet Union was an exemplar of modernity and progress. The British colonial civil servant R.O. Wingate sourly noted, and I quote, "The ambitious young workman from Kashgar or Ili goes over to Russia to get a temporary job and at once finds himself in a land of unveiled women, railways, motor cars, cinemas, and all that he believes to constitute the acme of modern civilization." To make things worse for China, Yang Senghin's chosen military representative in Kashgar, the ethnic Hui Muslim Ma Fuxing, rapidly alienated the population. The British Consul General in Kashgar, Claremont Screen, wrote that he made everyone call him Padshah or Emperor on pain of death and assembled a harem of the prettiest Turkic Muslim women in Kashgar. Meanwhile, his agents roamed the countryside, and I'm quoting, looking for new cows to milk. For all practical purposes, the oil wells at Aksu, the copper mines at Kanjigan, jade mines at Tung on the upper Yarkand River, and coal mines throughout the region, as well as taxes from the region's bazaars, became Ma's personal property. Those who protested, the Russian refugee P.S. Nazarov recorded, met a very unpleasant end. In Kashgar, Nazarov saw, I quote, bundles of men's amputated arms or feet nailed to the city gates, with notices stating whose members they were and why they were cut off. Sometimes the lawful owner of the arms or legs would be chained to the wall with them. Yang Sengxin was assassinated in 1926 by one of his own officials. His successor, Qin Shuzhen, proved similarly talented in coercion but not in politics. As China itself drifted into internal conflict and economic bankruptcy, Xinjiang imploded into warlordism and ethnic bloodletting. The tragic violence of 1993 claimed the lives of many, including Hindus living in Xinjiang, while some ethnic Han were compelled to accept Islam as the price for staying alive. Following the hideous violence of 1933, the Soviet Union stepped in to provide military assistance to Sheng Shikai, an ambitious Han warlord who crushed Ma's army in 1934. He assumed power in Xinjiang, acutely aware that his ethnic background was a liability in the charged communal climate. He responded by launching a campaign of Sovietization, complete with national minority representatives in government, non-Han media, minority education, stirring Marxist and Leninist propaganda, and so on. This was the same model the Soviet Union practiced in its Central Asian republics. The Kazakhs, though, soon started to chafe under Sheng's forced requisitions of sheep and cattle, and from 1936 to 1940, approximately 10,000 Kazakhs fled to neighboring provinces. The Altai Kazakhs remained quiet until 1940, when Sheng began to send representatives of his Committee for the Liquidation of Firearms among the Mongols, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz to the Altai steppe to take away their weapons. Faced with an ultimatum to hand over his rifle and compromise his nomadic lifestyle, Osman opened fire on Sheng's emissaries. Then, in order to send an even stronger message, he led an ambush on a Soviet geological expedition that Sheng had invited into the Altai Mountains. Like earlier rebels, Osman would have almost certainly met an unhappy end, but he was saved by Nazi Germany's march on Moscow in the summer of 1941. Sheng took advantage of the siege of Stalingrad in 1942 to banish all Soviet advisors and terminate the mining and industrial agreements he had signed with Moscow. This made him de facto emperor of Xinjiang, but as you'll see, there was a price. The Soviet dictator Stalin was determined to punish Sheng and now turned to Osman. Osman was wary of Stalin's intentions but agreed to receive Soviet aid on the condition that it be funneled through Mongolia. Now backed by Mongolian air power and equipped with the latest firearms, he began to inflict stunning losses on Sheng's army. Suddenly under siege, retreating Chinese generals cabled Urumqi with news that Kazakh bandits on horseback were somehow managing to ferociously bombard Chinese outposts with heavy artillery. Of course, it was the Soviets. Late in 1945, as the Second World War wound down, the wheel of treachery took another turn. The catalyst was growing Soviet intervention in what had come to be known as the East Turkestan Republic, the ostensibly independent country set up in northwestern Xinjiang's districts of Ili, Tashkent, and Altai. Through their client armies, the Soviets took back most of the privileges that they had enjoyed under Sheng. As a result, Osman and the more independence-minded leaders of the East Turkestan Republic now switched sides to backing the nationalists in Beijing. Unfortunately, wrote Beria from Moscow, the Kazakh Robin Hood does not intend to recognize the reorganized government of East Turkestan and believes himself to be the Khan or king of the Altai. Even as China degenerated into full-blown civil war between the communists and the nationalists, Osman chose to back the losing side. His decision was likely fueled by hope he would secure some assistance from the United States. The CIA's Douglas McKiernan, who posed as America's vice consul in Urumqi, made Osman big promises of military aid and supplies in exchange for rock samples from the Altai Mountains. The United States wanted to know if the Soviets were hunting for uranium ore in the region, but McKiernan also thought Osman would be a valuable asset in what he thought would be an inevitable future war. For a time, it seemed Osman's pursuit of what we today call multipolarity might be paying off. Powerful neighbors were competing for his favor by offering weapons and provisions, thereby allowing him to increase the strength of his following and army. Yet none proved capable of shackling him to a sedentary geopolitical agenda. The crushing victory of the PLA, though, brought in numbers of troops that Osman's Kazakhs just could not match. And the promises of Western support did not materialize either. In 1951, Osman was hunted down and later executed in a public square in Urumqi. Tens of thousands of Han settlers now began to flood Xinjiang every year, eventually raising their numbers from less than 5% of the total population in 1949 to near parity with the Uyghur majority by the 1970s, crushing any hope for independence. The last eyewitness account we have suggests that Osman met his executioner willingly. I quote, "Osman told me that he intended to stay behind and was not willing to continue onward." While Osman and a ragtag band of ill and wounded dedicated diehards held out for another year before their leader met his end, approximately 10,000 to 15,000 Kazakhs did flee for the Tibetan passes, led by Ali Beg Rahim, Hussein, Teichi, and Sultan Sharif, one band of 350 starving refugees managed to cross the Tibetan Indian border in the summer of 1951, just ahead of the PLA. That is where General Panag tells us the Indian army comes into the story by blocking the PLA's pursuit beyond Chushul in Ladakh and allowing the Kazakhs to retreat. Osman's key Lieutenant Yulbars Khan and his followers, meanwhile, reached Lhasa in January 1951 after a remarkable crossing of the Tibetan plateau in the midwinter. Once in Lhasa, most of the refugees were detained by the Dalai Lama. The Yulbars and 5 of his companions were permitted to proceed to Darjeeling. Yulbars then travelled overland to Calcutta before flying to Taiwan, where he arrived in May 1951 and was given a sinecure under the Kuomintang as governor of Xinjiang in exile. Having reconstituted a semblance of nomadic life among the verdant Kashmir plains from 1952 to mid-1954, all the surviving Kazakhs eventually agreed to relocate to settlements in rural Anatolia in Turkey. They're still there, along with 2 sizable Turkic refugee communities from Xinjiang, the first of roughly 1,000 former oasis-dwelling Uyghurs who fled in early 1949 before the PLA entered the province. The other group consists of about 1,300 Kazakh refugees who had fled Xinjiang over a decade during the violence of the 1930s and 40s, when Osman was just beginning to make his name known in the clashes with Sheng Shikai. The Kazakhs' retreat into India was likely read by China's strategic community against a less than benevolent backstory. The Kuomintang commander Ma Hushan and his advisor had also retreated to Kolkata and then safely returned to the Chinese coast in 1937 after finding themselves at the losing end of battles there. Like Imperial Britain, the PLA probably suspected that India was building clients and allies who could harry China. Later events may have fueled those suspicions. B.N. Malik, the intelligence bureau chief, chose to turn a blind eye as the CIA ran secret flights supplying insurgents in Tibet operating out of East Pakistan. Exactly how much Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru knew or wanted to know about the CIA business remains unclear. According to scholar Christopher Andrew, Malik kept much of the liaison with the British MI5 and the CIA out of Nehru's view, fearing the Prime Minister would shut it down. Historian John Garver has noted that whatever the actual extent of Indian intelligence complicity with US covert operations, Beijing believed that Nehru knew of and cooperated with CIA efforts, laying the foundations for the misjudgments and missteps that eventually led to the War of 1962. There's no Indian account of why asylum was granted to the Kazakhs in 1951. Remember, Prime Minister Nehru is supposed to have wanted to avoid confrontation with China. Was it a humanitarian gesture? A bargaining chip? Some kind of reflexive continuation of colonial policy by a country that had just become independent? We may never know. The incident has found no mention in any Indian account of the march to 1962. A Kazakh peasant who fought on horseback, though, had taken the first steps that herded 2 great nations to war. That war is long over, of course. In Xinjiang itself, Osman's son made peace with the PLA and even helped Communist China suppress future generations of Kazakh insurgents. Today, a massive wave of Han-Chinese settlement has put an end to the separatist story in Xinjiang. But it's a fascinating story to which I'm very grateful to General Panag for giving us the first insights that shows how small events in the neighborhood can have unpredictable, enormous consequences for the fate of nations. I'm Praveen Swami. I'm a contributing editor at ThePrint. Thank you again for joining and watching this episode of ThePrint's Explorer series.